On a single afternoon in August of 1974, roughly 39,000 people walked out of the most glamorous beach resort in the Mediterranean and never came back. They left meals on the stoves, certain they would be home within days. This was Varosha, the French Riviera of Cyprus, where Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton kept a favourite hotel beside the sea. 50 years on, that hotel still stands. So does the whole city. And behind a wall of rusted barbed wire, not one of those 39,000 has ever walked home. You can stand on a public beach in Cyprus today and look straight at it. A skyline of high-rise hotels facing the water, curtains still hanging in a few of the windows, the balconies where a jet-set crowd once drank in the evening sun, now furred green with 50 years of weeds. This is no bombed-out ruin. Almost nothing here was levelled. The buildings are whole or whole enough to break your heart, and that is the strange and terrible centre of this story. Varosha survived the war that emptied it almost untouched. It was taken perfectly intact, sealed behind a fence, and then held like a hostage for half a century because it was worth far too much for anyone to simply hand it back. This is the story of the richest ghost town on earth, and of how a single afternoon set the clock stopping for 50 years. To understand how a whole city ends up frozen mid-holiday, you have to understand just how bright it burned first. In its golden years, roughly 1970 to 1974, Varosha was not some quiet corner of a small island. It was, by a great many accounts, one of the most fashionable places on the entire planet to take a holiday. The main artery ran straight down to the shore, a broad seafront avenue named, of all things, for John F. Kennedy, and along it stood a wall of gleaming modern hotels with names that meant something to the wealthy of the era. There was the King George, the Asterias, the Florida, and above all the Argo, the one the newspapers of the day said Elizabeth Taylor loved best of all, the retreat the most photographed woman in the world chose when she wanted the sea and the sun and a little distance from the cameras. Taylor and Burton were far from the only names on the guest list. Brigitte Bardot came to lie on those beaches. So did a rotating cast of the rich, the famous, and the merely enormously comfortable, drawn by some of the finest sand in the eastern Mediterranean and a nightlife that ran late and glittered hard. The place had earned its nickname, honestly. In an age when Beirut had been the pleasure capital of the region, Varosha was quietly taking that crown, catching the money and the celebrities as the older resorts of the coast slid toward their own troubles. For a few short years, this was where the eastern Mediterranean came to be seen. On a summer evening at the height of the season, the whole strip came alive. The hotel terraces filled with the sound of glasses and conversation in half a dozen languages. The neon of the bars and the cinemas washed out across the pavements, and the warm night air coming off the water carried the smell of salt and cigarettes and expensive perfume. Couples strolled the length of Kennedy Avenue long after dinner. Somewhere along the front, a band always seemed to be playing. It was the kind of place that seemed to promise that the summer and the money and the youth of everyone caught up in it might simply go on forever. And the numbers underneath the glamour are almost harder to believe than the celebrities. This one district held close to 45% of the entire island's hotel bed capacity. Famagusta, the city Varosha belonged to, made up only around 7% of the population of Cyprus, and yet it accounted for roughly half of every hotel room on the island. In 1973, this single town, on this single stretch of coast, pulled in more tourists than every other town in Cyprus put together. Picture about 5 kilometres of beach, packed edge to edge with high-rise hotels, and cranes still climbing along the skyline because the demand showed not the faintest sign of slowing. And a great many of the people filling those hotels were British. Cyprus had been a British colony right up until 1960, and even after independence the island stayed knitted tightly to Britain, with British military bases still on its soil, and British families treating it as a warm and familiar corner of what had so recently been their own empire. When the package holiday boom arrived in the 1960s, and cheap flights began carrying ordinary Britons out to the Mediterranean sun, for the first time, Varosha was perfectly placed to catch them. They came for the long golden beaches, and the easy glamour, and the feeling that this was somewhere both genuinely exotic and reassuringly close to home. British money and British holidaymakers were a good part of the engine driving those cranes ever higher along the shore. That last detail matters more than it first appears. The cranes never stopped, because nobody building in Varosha believed the party could ever end. Money was pouring in from Britain, from Scandinavia, from the Gulf, and developers threw up new towers on the simple assumption that next year would be this year, with more of everything stacked on top. Some of those hotels were still only half built when the world changed. The scaffolding went up, the concrete floors were poured, and then one day the workers walked off the site and never came back. Those concrete skeletons are still standing today, 5 decades later, caught mid-construction, waiting for a completion that will never arrive. It may be the quietest and most chilling thing about the whole place. Not the towers that were finished and abandoned, but the ones that were frozen in the very act of being born. And it is worth remembering, before we go any further, that Varosha was never only a playground for visitors. Behind the seafront line of hotels lay a real and ordinary city, home to those 39,000 permanent residents. There were schools and churches and dentists and grocers. There were children who had learned to swim off that beach, and families who had built the whole of their lives around the tourist season, running the restaurants and the bars and the little shops that sold sun hats and postcards. The glamour was the surface. Underneath it was an entire working community, prosperous and settled and utterly convinced that the good years would simply keep on coming. Almost nobody living there in the early summer of 1974 had the faintest idea that the whole of it was about to vanish. Now we have to leave the beach for a while, because to see how the busiest resort on the whole Mediterranean coast became the emptiest street in Europe, you have to look at a wound that ran underneath every cocktail bar and hotel lobby in the city. It had been open a very long time. Cyprus had won its independence from Britain in 1960, and independence had not so much brought peace as frozen an argument in place. The island was home to 2 communities, a Greek Cypriot majority and a Turkish Cypriot minority, and they did not share a vision of what the new country was supposed to become. Many Greek Cypriots dreamed of enosis, union with Greece. Many Turkish Cypriots feared precisely that, and looked instead toward partition or protection, or simply being left in peace. In 1963 and 1964, the argument turned violent, and in the fighting, the Turkish Cypriots increasingly pulled back into defended enclaves, withdrawing into the old walled city of Famagusta, and away from the glittering Greek Cypriot resort rising to the south. That was the fault line. Varosha, for all its wealth, was built directly on top of it. The resort was overwhelmingly Greek Cypriot. Barely 2 kilometers to the north, inside the medieval Venetian walls of the old town, lived a Turkish Cypriot community that had spent a decade feeling besieged and cut off. The prosperity of the beach was completely real. So were the tensions behind it, and those tensions were older, deeper, and by that final summer armed on every side. The tourists sunbathing on Kennedy Avenue had almost no idea they were lying on a fault line that was about to move. When the spark finally came, it did not even come from Cyprus, it came from Athens. On the 15th of July 1974, the military junta then ruling Greece backed a coup on the island, sending Greek Cypriot gunmen to overthrow the Cypriot president, Archbishop Makarios III, and to put in his place a hardline nationalist named Nikos Sampson, a man whose entire programme could be boiled down to union with Greece, by force if necessary. Makarios fled the island with his life, and to the Turkish government watching across the narrow water, this was the nightmare made real. A Greek takeover of Cyprus, a stone's throw from the Turkish coast, with a known militant now sitting in the presidential chair and a besieged Turkish Cypriot minority suddenly at his mercy. Turkey answered with an invasion. Just 5 days after the coup, on the 20th of July 1974, Turkish forces landed on the north coast of Cyprus in strength, and the fighting that followed would carve the island permanently in TTU. The army advanced in 2 phases across that summer, and it was the second phase in the middle of August that finally rolled toward Famagusta and the golden strip of Varosha beyond it. The tanks came down from the north, through the medieval walled town, toward a beachfront where, only weeks before, holidaymakers had been rubbing sun cream into their shoulders and ordering another round from the bar. And here is the part that is almost impossible to hold steady in your mind. The end of Varosha was not a long siege, it was not a drawn-out battle, it was an afternoon. A woman named Eleni Elinas was there, and she remembers being woken by air raid sirens just after 5 in the morning on the 14th of August. Her family had moved into the district only 8 months earlier, and the boxes from that move were still stacked, half unpacked, in the hallway of a home they had barely begun to live in. Outside, the sky over Famagusta was filling with the sound of an approaching army. And all across Varosha, in the hotels and the apartment blocks and the neat modern houses, tens of thousands of people were making the very same calculation at the very same moment. Grab the documents, grab the children, leave everything else exactly where it sits, because we will be back in a day or two, once all this blows over. They were not back in a day or two. They loaded whatever would fit into the car and they drove south, joining a river of people all fleeing the same way, and behind them they left a city caught mid-breath. Meals were left cooking on the stoves, wedding presents sat unopened on tables, dishes stood in the sink, laundry hung on the lines, and beach towels lay drying over the balcony rails in the morning heat. In the big seafront hotels, the season had been in full swing that very morning, rooms booked solid, restaurants taking reservations for dinners that would now never be served. A handful of British holidaymakers, unsure where to run, sheltered in a hotel called the Golden Sands along with the staff, and became some of the very last civilians left in the entire district. Something close to 39,000 human lives, a whole community with its schools and its shops and its Sunday routines, poured out of Varosha in a matter of hours, on one hot August afternoon, and pulled the door shut behind them, fully expecting to open it again by the weekend. Varosha was not alone in its catastrophe that summer, though it would become the most haunting emblem of it. As the Turkish advance rolled across the north of the island, Famagusta itself was bombed and hundreds of thousands of Greek Cypriots were driven south of the new front line, while Turkish Cypriots moved the other way, northward, in their own frightened exodus. By the time the guns fell silent, Cyprus had been split cleanly into two, along a ceasefire line that soldiers grimly nicknamed the Attila Line, after the Turkish plan that had drawn it. Whole towns changed hands, and whole populations were uprooted almost overnight. But of all the places emptied in those terrible weeks, only one would be sealed behind a fence and preserved, deliberately, as though someone fully intended to come back and collect it later. That place was Varosha. Here is where the story turns from tragedy into something stranger, because the Turkish army had not originally set out to take Varosha at all. Their objective was the old walled city and the Turkish Cypriot community sheltering inside it. But when the soldiers reached the edge of the resort and found it standing there, glittering, valuable, and almost completely deserted, the whole calculation shifted. They moved in. And then, instead of occupying the district, or looting it and marching on, or filling it with new residents, they did something far stranger and far more lasting. They ran a fence around the entire thing. If you are finding all of this as hard to believe as I did the first time I heard it, stay with me, because the reason for that fence is the darkest and the cleverest part of the whole affair, and it is the single thing that explains why the city is still empty tonight. So consider the obvious question: why would an army fight its way to a resort worth a fortune, a district of hotels and villas and beachfront whose value ran into the billions, and then lock the gate and simply walk away from it? Not to settle it, not to sell it, not to tear it down, but only to seal it, post guards at the wire, and let it sit there in the sun. On its face, it makes no sense at all. It only begins to make sense once you understand what Varosha was truly for, the moment the shooting stopped. From that afternoon onward, its entire value to the people who now held it lay in a single cold word: leverage. Here is the logic, cold as it is. The invasion had left Cyprus split down the middle, with Turkish forces holding the north and a Greek Cypriot population, hundreds of thousands strong, driven south of a brand new dividing line. That division would have to be negotiated one day, in some room, by some diplomats, and when that day came, whoever held Varosha would be holding the single most valuable card on the whole table. An intact, world-famous billion-dollar resort handed back to its rightful owners would be the richest concession Turkey could ever offer in exchange for the things it wanted, which were recognition, lasting security guarantees for the Turkish Cypriots, and a settlement drawn on its own terms. Knock Varosha down and you have thrown away the bargaining chip. Fill it with strangers and you can never cleanly give it back. So you keep it exactly, precisely as it is, whole enough to keep promising its owners that they might one day return, sealed tightly enough to make certain that, for now, they never can. That was the plan, and it arrived wrapped in one comforting assumption. The fence would be temporary. Negotiations would surely move quickly. A deal would be struck within a few years, and Varosha would change hands and fill up again with light and tourists and noise. Even the wider world seemed to agree it could not be allowed to stand. In 1984, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 550, which declared any attempt to resettle Varosha with anyone other than its original inhabitants inadmissible under international law. The world had spoken, clearly and formally, and Turkey did not comply. The negotiations did not move quickly. They did not, in any meaningful sense, move at all. And that temporary fence slowly hardened into something permanent, a scar of wire and warning signs running straight through a modern city, cutting it off from the living world on the other side. The division only hardened as the years went by. In 1983, the Turkish Cypriot North formally declared itself a separate country, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, a state that to this day is recognized by exactly one government anywhere on earth, the government in Turkey that had helped to create it. With the island now split not merely by a ceasefire line, but by two rival administrations that could barely agree on the shape of a negotiating table, the prospect of a grand settlement, the very thing that was supposed to bring down Varosha's fence within a few short years, drifted further out of reach with every passing decade. This is the true engine of the whole tragedy, and it deserves to be said as plainly as it can be. The war did not destroy Varosha. The peace did. The days of actual fighting cost the district almost nothing in bricks and concrete. What killed the place was the decades of frozen non-resolution that came afterward, the endless deadlock in which no deal was ever quite reached and no homecoming was ever quite allowed. A city can survive being conquered in an afternoon. What Varosha could not survive was being kept behind a fence for 50 years. And in those 5 decades behind the wire, something happened to the place that is stranger even than the legend which grew up to explain it. Because almost everything you think you know about the ghost town frozen in time turns out to be wrong. And so the decades went to work, quietly, behind the wire, with no one watching but the guards in their towers. For years, the only glimpses the outside world got of the interior came from aerial photographs and long lenses pushed through the fence, and those images told a single slow story of surrender to nature. Trees pushed up through the marble floors of hotel lobbies where doormen in uniform had once stood. Vines climbed the faces of the towers and swallowed whole balconies. Grass burst through the cracked tarmac of that grand avenue named for a murdered American president. Set 2 aerial photographs side by side, one from the 1970s and one from just a few years ago, and you can watch a bright Mediterranean resort dissolve, street by street, back into green, as though the island itself was slowly digesting the thing that had been built upon it. Now a legend grew up around Varosha across those silent years, and you have very likely seen a version of it. The story goes that the whole city is a perfect time capsule, a place where the clock stopped dead in 1974 and everything stayed exactly as it had been left. Car dealerships still full of gleaming brand new 1970s models under a soft layer of dust. Shop windows still dressed with mannequins in bright mod fashion, the price tags still hanging from the sleeves. Dining tables still laid for a dinner that was abandoned halfway through. It is a beautiful, haunting picture, and for a lot of people it is the whole reason they know the name Varosha at all. It is also, in large part, a myth, and the truth turns out to be sadder than the legend. Because in the months right after the district was sealed, long before nature ever got its chance, people got there first. Soldiers and looters worked their way through the empty streets and stripped Varosha of anything that could be carried out. Furniture, fittings, electronics, the stock from the shops, the very cars from the dealership lots. Everything portable went out through the fence and did not come back. By the time the outside world began romanticizing the perfectly preserved city behind the wire, the reality inside was a hollow shell. Buildings with their window frames torn out and their rooms scraped bare. The bones of a resort with all its flesh already carried away. The enduring image of Varosha as a genteel place where time simply paused is not quite honest. Varosha was emptied of its people in a single afternoon, and then, over the following months, emptied of nearly everything else they had ever owned. What survived behind the fence was closer to a carcass, picked clean and left to the weeds. In the absence of any living soul, the place naturally grew its own ghosts. Over the years, a story took hold, passed between the soldiers on the wire and the guides who now bring visitors to the edge of it, of a figure they call the Lady in White, said to be the spirit of a hotel manager who refused to leave when everyone else fled, and who is said to walk the empty corridors still. It is almost certainly nothing more than a legend. The kind and abandoned city grows the way its lobbies grow trees. But it is a fitting one. Varosha had become the sort of place where even the ghost stories are about someone who could not bear to go home. And for the people who had run on that August afternoon, this was the cruelest turn of all. They had not lost their homes to a fire or an earthquake, the kind of clean and final catastrophe a person can grieve and slowly move past. Their homes were still standing. In many cases, they could drive to the very edge of the buffer zone that now split the island, raise a pair of binoculars and see their own street, their own balcony, their own front door, aging and rotting a few hundred meters away, close enough to name and far too far to touch. The keys were still in their pockets. Some of them carried those keys for the rest of their lives, a small heavy weight in a coat, opening a door that no longer opened to anyone. That is a particular kind of pain, sharper in its own quiet way than destruction. The knowledge that the thing you lost was never actually gone, only forbidden, decaying just out of reach, while the years stacked up and the negotiations that were meant to bring you home produced decade after decade absolutely nothing. For the exiles, the fence became a fixed point of grief. Over the years, former residents would gather at the edge of the buffer zone to look across at the town they could no longer enter, and Famagusta itself became a byword in the Greek Cypriot world for everything the invasion had taken and never given back. Parents described to their children the exact layout of a home those children would never be allowed to stand in. The longing hardened into a slogan, a demand, a wound carried down the generations, and still nothing moved. The talks that were supposed to settle the island's future opened and stalled and opened again, year after year, decade after decade, and each time the fence stayed exactly where it was. For 46 years, that was the whole of it. A sealed city, a rusting fence, a scattered generation of former residents growing old in the south with their useless keys, and a world that mostly forgot Varosha existed at all, except as a curiosity, the eerie ghost resort that surfaced in a photo essay every few years. And then, in the autumn of 2020, the fence moved. In October of that year, the Turkish Cypriot authorities, with firm backing from Ankara, abruptly reopened a stretch of Varosha's famous beachfront to the public. The barriers came down along one section of the coast, and for the first time in almost half a century, ordinary people walked freely on that sand beneath the crumbling towers. The following month, the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, travelled to the ghost town in person and sat down to a picnic on the very beach the refugees had fled, an image beamed around the world as a deliberate statement of intent. In the summer of 2021, on the 47th anniversary of the invasion, the Turkish Cypriot leader Ersin Tatar announced that a far larger slice of the sealed zone, more than 3 square kilometres of it, would pass from military into civilian control. The response was about as close to unanimous as international diplomacy ever comes. All 15 members of the United Nations Security Council, including every one of its permanent powers, condemned the move and called for it to be reversed, reaffirming that any resettlement of Varosha by anyone but its original inhabitants remained inadmissible, exactly as the world had declared back in 1984. The reopening changed nothing about the underlying deadlock, but it changed the picture entirely. A few of the streets inside the fence were resurfaced so that day trippers could move through them more easily. Bicycles appeared for hire. Little stalls sold cold drinks at the edge of the ruins. And now, on almost any afternoon, you can find sunbathers laying out their towels on that reclaimed strip of coast, wading into the same clear water the jet set once swam in, cycling slowly past the gutted hotels and taking photographs of themselves against a backdrop of half-collapsed balconies and empty window frames. They do all of it under the eyes of armed soldiers, in a place a United Nations resolution still insists no one should be. It is one of the strangest tourist experiences on Earth, a holiday snapshot taken inside a crime scene that has never been cleared, on a beach that still legally belongs to people who are watching it, some of them through binoculars from the far side of the wire. And for the original owners, the 50-year wound has now been reopened in the most modern and bureaucratic way imaginable. Greek Cypriots whose families fled in 1974 are, in some cases, permitted to go back and see what became of their homes. They are even invited to make a claim on those very properties, to seek compensation or return, through a commission set up by the Turkish Cypriot authorities. At first hearing, it sounds like a kind of belated justice. It is anything but simple, because to file that claim, to sit down before that commission, is to treat the occupying authority as legitimate, to accept its right to rule on the fate of your own stolen home, and the Greek Cypriot government has pleaded with its own people not to do it, warning that every claim filed is another brick set into the wall of permanent division. So here is the final cruelty, and it is offered with a smile. What is a family home really worth if the only way to win it back is to bless the very power that took it away? That is the choice. Varosha's exiles are left holding, 5 decades on, along with those old and useless keys, which brings us back in the end to where we began, to a single afternoon in August of 1974, and to a hotel on a seafront avenue where Elizabeth Taylor once watched the sun go down over the cleanest water in the Mediterranean. That hotel is still standing tonight. The avenue is still there, cracked and green and silent. The sea is exactly as blue as it ever was. Everything that made Varosha the most glamorous resort in the eastern Mediterranean is, in the strictest technical sense, still present and accounted for. The beach and the buildings and the view all remain, the whole gorgeous skeleton of the paradise standing intact above the sand. What is missing is the only thing that ever truly mattered, the nearly 39,000 people who once called this place home and who were told on the day they ran that they would be back by the weekend. They believed it, and it was the most reasonable thing in the world to believe. It turned out instead to be the first afternoon of the longest exile of their lives, locked out of a city that a war could not destroy, and a peace has never quite found the will to give back. The hotel where Elizabeth Taylor once watched the sun go down is waiting for its people still. By now, it has learned how to wait. If this story stayed with you, there is another one already waiting on your screen right now, a place with its own improbable rise and its own quiet undoing, and I think you are going to want to see exactly how that one ends. Give it a click. And while you are here, subscribe, so the next story like this one finds its way to you too.